It was a Thursday morning in early March, and I was standing at the edge of the loading dock watching our third straight overnight shipment roll out on time, when my phone buzzed with a calendar invite from someone I'd never heard of. The name was Trent Gallagher. His title said Senior Operations Advisor, Interim Division Lead. I had to read it twice because I'd been at Meridian Packaging for 19 years and I'd never seen that title before in my life. I found out at the all-hands meeting that afternoon. Our VP of Operations was taking early retirement. Health reasons, the email said, though later I heard it was more complicated than that. And while the board figured out a permanent replacement, they were bringing in someone with fresh strategic vision. My director said it with a straight face. I remember thinking, fresh strategic vision at a corrugated packaging plant outside of Hamilton. Okay, Trent Gallagher was 29 years old. He had an MBA from Queens and had spent the previous 3 years at a consulting firm in Toronto advising, as far as I could tell from his LinkedIn, companies he'd never actually worked inside. He was also, and this part didn't come out until his second week, the son-in-law of Douglas Mercer. Douglas Mercer, who had founded Meridian Packaging in 1987 out of a rented warehouse in Stony Creek, and who still owns 63% of the company. I want to be fair here. I genuinely tried to give the man a chance. My name is Keith. I'm 51. I started at Meridian when I was 32, came in as a shift supervisor after years on the floor at a plastics manufacturer in Brantford, and worked my way up to Director of Production Operations. I know our lines the way I know the layout of my own house. I can walk the floor at 2 in the morning during a breakdown and tell you within 4 minutes what's wrong and who to call. I've trained probably 60 people over the years, some of whom are now supervisors themselves. I am not a person who intimidates easily, and I am not a person who needs to be the smartest one in the room. I just need the room to be moving in a productive direction. Trent was not moving us in a productive direction. His first week, he held what he called a diagnostic listening tour, which meant he walked around with a clipboard asking people questions like, "Where do you see the biggest opportunity for operational synergy?" to guys who'd been running shrink wrap machines since before he was in high school. I followed him around one afternoon and watched a senior line tech named, I'll just call him my colleague, a man who's been here since the 90s, answer Trent's synergy question with a completely straight face. Probably the number 3 sealer. It runs hot on the right side, and nobody's written it up properly in about 8 months. Trent wrote something on his clipboard. I genuinely don't know what he wrote because it was not about the number 3 sealer. We had that conversation 3 weeks later when the thing finally seized up mid-run. His second week, he sat in on our Q1 production review. I'd been running these meetings for 6 years. We came in with our numbers. We were at 94.3% on-time delivery for the quarter, up from 88.1% the same sort of previous year. Our waste rate was down. Our line efficiency was up. We had landed 2 new contracts with food manufacturers in the Niagara region, partly because we'd invested 18 months ago in faster changeover procedures that I had personally designed and pushed through over some resistance from the previous VP. Trent listened to all of this with his arms crossed and then said, "These numbers are solid, but I think we're leaving margin on the table by not integrating predictive scheduling software into the workflow. I've been looking at a platform out of Waterloo that uses AI to optimize shift deployment." I asked him if he'd looked at what our current labor agreements said about scheduling changes. He said he'd loop in HR at the appropriate juncture. I wrote that phrase down when I got back to my office. I looked at it for a while. Here is the thing about Meridian that you need to understand. We are not a glamorous business. We make boxes. We make trays and inserts and custom foam packaging, and the kind of industrial corrugated containers that keep auto parts from rattling around in shipping containers going to assembly plants in Windsor and Cambridge. It is unglamorous, it is precise, and it runs on relationships. Our customers stay with us because when they call at 11 at night with a crisis shipment, someone answers, and that someone knows what to do. That is not something a scheduling algorithm from Waterloo is going to replicate. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The real moment, the one that changed everything, came in the last week of April. We had just completed what I genuinely believe was the best quarter in the history of this facility. I don't say that lightly. We'd absorbed a surprise order from a client whose previous supplier had gone under unexpectedly, a massive run of specialized food-grade packaging, and we'd fulfilled it in 11 days. 11 days. Our regular order cycles run 3 to 5 weeks. To do it, we ran extended shifts. I personally renegotiated a short-term material agreement with our supplier in Mississauga on a Saturday morning, and every single person on the floor gave something extra. We hit 312% of our contracted volume target for April. Our largest client sent a letter, an actual letter on paper, to Douglas Mercer himself, thanking him for the reliability of our team. I heard about that letter secondhand. Trent did not mention it at the operations meeting. What Trent mentioned at the operations meeting was that Q2 performance bonuses were being suspended. I want to sit with that for a second, because I want you to understand what those bonuses meant. At Meridian, our production staff gets a quarterly bonus tied to performance targets. It's in their employment agreements. It's not huge. We're talking a few hundred to maybe $1,500 for most people, depending on their role and how the quarter went. But these are people making $45,000 a year in some cases. For a lot of them, that bonus is the difference between managing okay and actually getting a little bit ahead. Some of them had been counting on it to close out RRSP contributions before the deadline. Trent's reasoning was that the unexpected order had created cost overruns in overtime and materials procurement, and that the company needed to rebalance the operational budget before releasing discretionary compensation. He used the word discretionary. These were contractual bonuses. They were not discretionary. The room did not explode. That's what I remember most clearly. Nobody yelled. There was just this particular quality of silence that I've only heard a few times in my life, where you can feel an entire group of people making a decision about something. I looked around at people I've worked with for a decade and I could see it happening in their faces. Something closed. I asked Trent as calmly as I could manage to send me the specific language he was relying on to characterize those bonuses as discretionary. He said he'd have his assistant forward me the relevant documentation. Then he said, I get that people are disappointed, but we need to think about sustainable motivation frameworks going forward rather than tying performance to short-term payouts. I said, could you pull up the org chart for production operations for me? He looked confused but pulled it up on the screen. I said, can you point to anyone in that chart who wasn't part of what we just accomplished? He didn't say anything. I said thank you and I left the meeting. I went back to my office, closed the door, and sat down with my employment contract. My actual physical copy, which I keep in the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet in a manila folder that also contains my original offer letter from 2005. I have always been the kind of person who keeps their paperwork. My contract has a clause in it. Section 14B, if you want to know, that was negotiated when I came back to Meridian in 2019 after being approached by a competitor. Douglas Mercer himself had asked me to stay. We'd gone back and forth, and one of the things I'd asked for was a performance incentive clause tied directly to division output, exceeding annual targets by more than 200% in any given rolling quarter. The clause specified that in the event of such performance, and in the event that standard bonus structures were withheld or modified without mutual consent, I was entitled to a supplemental compensation payout equal to 150% of my annual base salary, payable within 60 days. I had genuinely forgotten about this clause until that afternoon. I sat there reading it 3 times. Then I called the employment lawyer who had reviewed my contract before I signed it in 2019. She was still at the same firm in Burlington. She remembered the clause immediately. She said, have you hit the threshold? I said 312% of target for the quarter. There was a pause. She said, Keith, that clause is still active. I thanked her. I hung up. I sat in my office for a while looking out at the parking lot, watching the transport trucks coming and going. And I thought about all the people on the floor who were going home that night to figure out how to explain to their families that the money they'd been counting on wasn't coming. Then I thought about the letter Douglas Mercer had received from our client, on actual paper. I called my director, one of the few people at Meridian I completely trust, and told him what I was thinking. He listened without saying anything for a long time. Then he said, if you're doing this, document everything first. I spent the next 4 days doing exactly that. I pulled every production record for the quarter. I had our systems team pull the volume data and run it against the contracted targets. I got a copy of the client's letter from our administrative coordinator, who was also furious about the bonus situation, and made no effort to hide it. I put together a package that was about 40 pages long and clearly showed, with no ambiguity, what the division had accomplished and what the contractual obligations were. On a Tuesday morning, I sent an email to Trent, copying our HR director and our CFO, formally notifying them that I was invoking Section 14B of my employment agreement and requesting a meeting within 5 business days to discuss the terms. I attached the full package. I did not hear back from Trent that day. I heard from the CFO within 2 hours. She wanted to meet the same afternoon. She had clearly read every page of the package, because she came in with her own annotated copy and a very particular expression on her face. The expression of someone who has just discovered a problem they didn't create and are not entirely unhappy to see surfaced. She confirmed the clause was valid. She said she needed to loop in legal and Douglas Mercer's office before any response could be given. I said of course, and that I understood the timeline outlined in Section 14 Bob would begin from the date of my written notice. She said yes, she understood that. The next 3 days were quiet in a way that felt like weather. I went about my work. I ran my shift briefings. I dealt with a supply delay on Wednesdays that required some quick resequencing on our number 2 line. I did my job the way I have always done my job, and I did not mention the clause to anyone except my director, who updated me once a day with a single raised eyebrow whenever I passed him in the hallway. On the Friday of that week, I was in the middle of a floor walk when my cell phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. It was Douglas Mercer. He said, "Keith, I'd like to have a conversation." His voice sounded exactly like it did the last time I'd spoken to him in person, which was 3 years ago at the company's Christmas party. Measured, thoughtful. The voice of a man who built something real. I said I was available whenever he liked. He said, "Would you be willing to join a video call this afternoon at 3? I'd like Trent on as well." I said yes. I went back to my office and sat down. I thought about a lot of things. I thought about 19 years of early mornings and late-night breakdown calls and weekends spent problem-solving line issues that nobody else wanted to deal with. I thought about the people on the floor who still didn't know whether they were getting their bonuses. I thought about my colleague who answered Trent's synergy question with something honest and useful, which Trent did not write down. At 3 o'clock, I opened the video call. Douglas was already on. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him in person, but alert, focused. He'd clearly been reviewing documents because there was a stack of papers beside him. Trent joined a minute later. He looked like someone who had not slept well and was working hard not to show it. Douglas said, "Keith, thank you for joining. I've spent the last few days reviewing the situation thoroughly, including your contract, the quarter's performance data, and some other matters that have come to my attention." I said I appreciated that. Douglas looked directly at Trent then. He said, "The decision to classify the quarterly bonuses as discretionary was made without my approval and without any consultation with legal or HR. I've been made aware of this in the last 48 hours. Trent started to say something about the cost overruns and the overtime numbers. Douglas said, "I've seen the numbers, Trent." That was it. That was all he said. But the way he said it, the flatness of it, was something I won't forget. Then Douglas looked back at me. He said, "Keith, the bonuses will be paid in full to all eligible employees by the end of the month. I want that to be clear." I felt something release in my chest that I hadn't realized I'd been holding for 2 weeks. I said, "I appreciate that very much. I know the team will as well." Douglas nodded. He said, "With respect to Section 14B, our legal team has reviewed it and confirmed its validity. We'll be in touch with you and your lawyer to arrange the appropriate payout within the timeline specified." I said I appreciated that too. Then Douglas looked at Trent again. He said, "Trent, I'm going to ask you to sign off for the rest of the call. You and I will speak separately." Trent's face did something complicated. He said, "Douglas, I really think we should." Douglas said, "Trent." Trent signed off. Douglas and I stayed on the call for another few minutes. He asked me how the team was doing genuinely, the way he used to when I'd see him walking the floor on the odd Friday afternoon back in the early days. I told him honestly. I said the people on the floor had done something remarkable and they deserved to feel good about it rather than penalized. He said, "I know. I should have been paying closer attention to what was happening here." He sounded like a man who meant it. He asked whether I'd be willing to step into a more formal senior leadership role on an interim basis while they worked through the transition. He mentioned a title. He mentioned a number that was genuinely significant. I thought about it for a moment. I said, I appreciate the offer. I really do. But I'm not sure a title changes much about what I actually do here, and right now what the team needs most is stability, not another reorganization. I'd like to keep doing my job if that's all right. There was a pause. He said, that's probably the most honest thing anyone has said to me about this situation. We ended the call. I sat in my office for a few minutes. Then I got up, walked out to the floor, found my director by the number 3 sealer, which, for the record, we had finally fixed properly 2 weeks prior, and told him the bonuses were coming. He closed his eyes for a second. Then he said, good. I don't know exactly what happened to my son-in-law after that call. That's not my story to tell, and frankly, it's not the part I spent much time thinking about. I heard through the usual channels, about 3 weeks later, that he'd transitioned out of his interim role. The company posted for a permanent VP of operations. The posting included, as the first line of its requirements, minimum 10 years of direct manufacturing or industrial operations experience. I helped write that posting. Trent Gallagher was a smart person who had been put in a position that required something he didn't have yet. Maybe he'll figure that out. Maybe the experience will teach him something that the MBA program didn't. That's genuinely not something I'm spending energy on. What I'm spending energy on is the same thing I've been spending energy on for 19 years. Making sure this floor runs well. Making sure the people on it are treated fairly. And making sure that when a customer calls at 11 at night with a crisis, we are the people who answer. My colleague stopped me in the hallway the week after the bonuses went out. He handed me a coffee, just handed it to me, didn't say anything about why, and then went back to his line. That was enough. That was more than enough. Some things you build over a long time, and they don't show up on a clipboard or a predictive analytics dashboard or an interim operations report. They show up in whether people hand you a coffee without being asked. In whether they run an extra shift without being pressured. In whether when things go sideways, they stay. Results always win. But results are made of people, and people remember how they were treated when it mattered. I walked back out to the floor the way I do every morning and got to work.